Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to kind of a special KASB update. We've missed you the last 2 weeks while the legislature has been off, but there have been several developments this week. And so we wanted to kind of talk to you about a couple things that are happening on this Friday, April 23rd. Scott, what has been happening?
Well, to kind of tackle it semi-chronologically, on Tuesday, the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group met. This is the group that meets twice a year, and they get together and kind of put an economic forecast together, and they put the revenue estimate together for legislators to use when they craft their budgets. So they met Tuesday. They increased the revenue estimate for the next 2 years by about $360 million. That provides pretty healthy ending balances for our state government. There have been years when we've had very meager ending balances, but these are pretty hefty. But even with the improved fiscal picture, Governor Kelly is urging caution. But I think it's fair to say the additional revenue that's been projected for the remainder of this fiscal year and then the next fiscal year, which starts July 1st, that additional revenue will probably increase pressure to cut taxes. So I guess the bottom line is the budget experts, the state fiscal experts are saying our economy is improving, but there are still many concerns, most obviously being that we still have this pandemic going on.
That's right. And so kind of the unknown factor is whether not being out of the woods, there could be new problems we don't see, balanced against the fact that some economists think that the economy is really going to take off nationally. And in fact, our consensus, the consensus estimating process for Kansas, the people who did this say that our economic trends in terms of personal income growth and those kinds of things should be as strong in Kansas as the rest of the country, not stronger, but not any worse as well. But yeah, the governor vetoed a tax bill before this news came out, basically saying, this would be very tough. And the final caveat is, although you're right, the tentative projection with this new money is like a 10% ending balance for next year. Next year's expenditures that the legislature is considering, if they approve the education funding that the governor's proposed, the Gannon settlement, would still be more than the tax money expected to come in. We can do that because we would have over $1 billion in ending balance this year because of the other revenue. So good fiscal news, but there are still a lot of challenges out there. So I think that'll be a big topic. So yeah, that was Tuesday. What else has happened this week?
Well, as expected, the governor on Thursday vetoed several education-related bills. She vetoed Senate Bill 55. This was the one that dealt with transgender athletes. She vetoed 2039. This is the one that required students pass a civics test and a course in financial literacy to graduate high school. And she vetoed House Bill 2089, which was a bill that said if school districts have gun safety programs, they have to use specific curriculum. And I think the one that gained the most headline attention was kindergarten through fifth grade. They had to use the NRA's Eddie Eagle program. So these bills, and as we just found out before we came on, she vetoed, what is the number of that bill?
2058.
2058, which lowered the concealed carry age from 21 to 18. This bill does not affect schools per se, because weapons may still not be carried in schools. So some pretty big vetoes. KASB testified as neutral on Senate Bill 55, the transgender bill, but cited numerous concerns. One of those being the federal government is moving in the opposite direction of this bill. And that, of course, leaves our school boards kind of in the lurch as far as legal vulnerability. And another concern that we brought up was that CASA already has guidelines on this issue when a dispute arises over whether a student can participate on a girls or women's team. 2039, the civics test and financial literacy bill. Of course, we thought that was an intrusion on local board decisions. In 2089, we did not take a stand on the gun safety bill because it still left it up to school boards whether or not to have these programs.
These were concerns not only from kind of a local impact, but the firearm training and the civics and financial literacy bill. Basically the State Board of Education essentially asked the governor to veto them on the grounds that it would intrude on their authority. I think that was part of the reason the governor cited. The governor also on the transgender bill raised some issues of potential boycotts and backlash, as well as concern about transgender students. And it should be noted that Senate Bill 55 also applied to post-secondary sports as well as high school sports. And of course, this is part of a trend around the nation. In fact, several Republican governors have vetoed these measures. I think one has been overridden as we're following what's happening around the rest of the country. We might just note that the governor today did sign a bill that the legislature passed and KSB supported, and that was a bill creating the Kansas Promise Scholarship Program, which is really geared at students in less than 4-year programs, tech ed programs or 2-year programs that either demonstrate kind of high wage, high demand, or on kind of a regional need. Institutions could come up with them. Pretty well crafted bill. It's expected to provide about $10 million in the first 2 years to do that. Presumably that is part of funding that's been identified. Governor vetoed a similar bill last year over concerns of funding, so apparently that's been resolved. She signed it this year, and that's something that the KSB has supported. I think the thing that we'll be looking for next is that on Tuesday, I believe it's Tuesday, the Ways and Means Committee comes back on the Senate to start working on the omnibus bill, which is normally a bill that is passed after the main budget has passed to kind of tie up loose ends, and frankly, a way to respond every year to when the consensus estimates come out. If they're high or low, it's kind of a last chance to tweak that. The big difference this year is that the legislature has not yet passed the K-12 education budget, although they've approved everything else. The House will come back Tuesday. It's possible that it may take more than one day for the two chambers to write their bill. The big question that we're not sure on is how the education bill will be handled, whether education funding will be part of the final omnibus bill that it's usually called, or a separate bill, as it was in the main session, where a proposal ended up failing on a tie vote in the Senate. As you all probably remember, this was tying the education funding to expansion of private school aid and restrictions on remote learning in particular. Should also just note the legislature has not passed an extension of the 20 mil statewide levy that's also necessary. So we will be watching next week closely. The legislature will come back for the final session a week from Monday. And that, of course, could take anywhere from a few days, that's very optimistic, to a few weeks. That gets more pessimistic. And a key thing is not only passing an education bill, but whether the legislature is able to override any of those vetoes that we've talked about. We would just note that we have put if you go to our KSB News section of our website, under the Tallman Education Report, I have put a couple of blogs that talk about kind of key points you may want to be talking with legislators about right now as you message them in the final days. We're also expecting to issue a joint statement kind of about the budget and where we think the legislature should focus when they return for the full session. So, Scott, we've just about got a minute left. Anything we're forgetting before we wish people a good weekend?
No, just that taxes and school finance are going to dominate the wrap-up session.
Absolutely. So be in communication now more than ever. We know your voices have been heard this session, but we need to continue to urge the legislature to get appropriate funding to defend COVID funding, to help us keep schools open and recover student learning. And we think as much as possible, keep local schools and the state board doing their job to address student needs as we try to come out of this. So with that, we hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks for joining us. And we'll be back next week, at least periodically, with reports before we start our regular reports on Monday, May 3rd. Thanks, everyone.